Welcome to Season 2 of Healing the Tigress, a podcast of conversations and stories on Asian American Pacific Islander maternal mental health. We are your hosts, Peggy, a perinatal mental health therapist,
and Jasmine, a clinical pharmacist who is perinatal mental health certified. As Taiwanese American mothers who live through postpartum depression and anxiety, we felt like we didn't hear about other AAPI mothers struggling with their mental health in new motherhood. But we knew it couldn't just be us.
So we created this podcast because we hope that sharing these stories can start to break the stigma of mental health in our community and help heal the inner tigress in all AAPI parents. Hi friends! For this episode, we will be focusing on support for parents with neurodivergent children. Among our AAPI community, it can feel like not enough people talk about the neurodivergent population and how it can impact their families and communities because of a heavy stigma, a stigma that echoes the one around talking about mental health. ASD, or autism spectrum disorder, is diagnosed at a slightly higher rate among AAPI children at 3.3% compared to the national average of 2.7%. However, AAPI children are being underserved when it comes to support for neurodivergent children.
So our guest today is a licensed clinical social worker and therapist who has experience working with parents of neurodivergent children. Please help us welcome Clarissa Chui, who we are very eager to speak with about the stigmas and the impacts of neurodivergence within our community. Clarissa, thank you for coming onto our show today. Would you please tell our listeners a little bit about yourself, your cultural background, and what you do specifically for work?
Yeah, hi. Thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be here. I know this is, Jasmine, you and I have spoke about just serving the AAPI population and especially our kiddos and families with on the neurodivergent spectrum. So I am a second generation Asian American. I was raised in the Bay Area, actually born in Hong Kong, but I came here at quite a young age. So I grew up with parents who followed the very strict Asian background and parenting style. So assimilating to American kids here was quite a experience.
And can you tell us a little bit about what you do for work?
Yeah, so I work with families who have kiddos diagnosed on the spectrum, specifically autism spectrum. So I work with their families and getting them connected to resources and supporting them. My official title is a care coordinator in the medical system.
And how long have you been doing this for?
So specifically in my role, I have been doing this for a little over 2 years. My past experience was working with families in a different capacity, as well as working with adults in inpatient psychiatric system, community mental health, intensive outpatient. Yeah, so it's been a fun ride.
While our discussion today will be focusing on neurodivergence, we always want to get to know our guests a little bit more in terms of their own journeys in motherhood, especially as it could be linked to the passion you have for the things you're doing now. So before we dive into kind of educating our listeners on neurodivergence, can you please tell us about your own postpartum journey in terms of experiencing perinatal mental health disorders and how that played a role in your motherhood journey?
So that's a great question. And I think postpartum and that journey and talking about the expectations of that and what to look for, that's often not discussed in our OBGYN appointments during your pregnancy. Like you see flyers on the wall, but it's not a real conversation oftentimes that doctors have with us. So my own personal journey. I have 2 kiddos and my son, he is now 5. My older child at the time, my firstborn, he was diagnosed with a medical condition that we found out when he was 1 week old. And when we got the news, there was a lot of unknown, right? It was very, very scary. Like our pediatrician rescheduled our 10 a.m. appointment to 6:30 in the morning with very clear instructions: stay away from babies, stay away from older adults, like the geriatric population, because we just don't know. And that the theme of, we don't know yet. Well, we need to do more testing, right? Like, we just don't know. There's the range of his function was so wide, and also the limitations of it, right? Like, being a first-time parent already is such a taxing experience almost sometimes for some of us parents. And the thoughts of it, like my thoughts immediately spiraled into blame, shame, guilt, ownership of his condition. And as a trained therapist, I missed it, right? Like, I was very much in my thoughts. So long story short, it very much transitioned into my own postpartum depression and postpartum anxiety. I had a feeling in my gut that something wasn't quite right, but there's so much when you Google it, right? It's like, is it postpartum blues? Is it postpartum depression? Like, what is that? And it wasn't until my son's pediatrician actually administered the postnatal scale. And then he came back in and said, man, you're having a really hard time. And I just burst out crying.
I feel like we have heard a few of our guests actually say that it was in the pediatrician's office that this was discovered, or even mentioned to them for the first time, because I imagine you were seeing the pediatrician a lot because you were having follow-ups about the medical condition, and you weren't seeing your OB for quite a while. So we talk a lot about these gateways of getting screened and what's the best approach in this system to catch moms and get them the help that they need before it gets really bad. So thanks for sharing a little bit of that background. And sounds like it ties in a little bit with kind of the work you do today, even about that anxiety and sort of like fear of the unknown, right? Because I'm sure a lot of parents who are given a diagnosis of a child on the spectrum feel that same sort of overwhelm of the unknown, and just a lot of thoughts can come through, like you said, the loneliness, the guilt, the shame, feeling like maybe you had a part in it. So I can kind of see some of those pieces aligning. And I want to take it back a little bit, and because I personally myself didn't really even know a lot about neurodivergence until maybe friends with kids were slowly starting to get diagnosed or telling me about it or educating me about it. And I want to give our listeners the chance also to learn. So what exactly is neurodivergence, and how do diagnoses like ASD or autism spectrum disorder, ADHD or AUDHD fit into this specific term?
Neurodivergence is one way of thinking about it, is how individuals, or especially kiddos, how their brain processes information. It's done differently. And it's done in a way where neurotypical folks, it's hard for them to relate to. Neurodivergence is a description. It's not an actual diagnosis. And under the neurodivergence umbrella, that's where it breaks down into actual diagnoses like autism disorder, ADHD and autism, Fragile X syndrome. And then it will get into a gateway of kiddos getting tested, like genetic testing. But it truly is, there is an overlap when, parenting is a journey. It has many highs, it has many lows. And the extra layer to it is parenting in our society, who has very much determined for us what is considered normal and what is considered not. And when you don't fit into the bubble of normalcy, then that's when you feel the pressure. The pressure is on. Another way of thinking about it is like individuals with ADHD. It's their process and understanding of self-awareness, self-evaluation, self-regulation, self-motivation. Those are things that they can struggle with. And how can we support them? How can we teach them a different way? Or how can we cater tools that enables them and empowers them to be able to be considered quote unquote normal in our society. And this is the same. This goes to kiddos with also autism.
Yeah, it's really such an umbrella to encompass basically just the different ways people's brains are functioning in a way to interact with the world. And I think there's so much more information out there now. It used to just be looking at autism, and now there's more information out there when it comes to things like sensory processing disorder, and people are just getting more aware of it. And maybe being more aware, they're able to look at their own children and say, hey, this is what's going on with my child. Because you think about sometimes you see these TikToks and reels that are like, I don't know where so and so got this from. And then you talk about like an older generation and you describe what maybe your grandfather was like or your father is like. And you're like, oh, you probably had autism spectrum disorder too. And it was never noticed or diagnosed back then. I'm curious what led you to want to work specifically with parents of children who are neurodivergent, or it sounds like specifically autism spectrum disorder.
I mentioned working with such a wide range of parents and individuals. And after my own postpartum journey, which was extremely humbling, and recognizing, man, parenting already in our society is there are so many challenges with it just because of some of the expectations and standards, right, that society has kind of set for us. And my heart really went out to even parents with kiddos with disabilities. And my background is very much in more of the behavioral background of looking at behaviors, looking at the functions of behaviors, and then that's how you determine interventions. And kiddos with autism or even neurodivergent kiddos, I wanted to support them in that way, because one of the things about parenting, whether you're a parent of neurotypical or neurodivergent child, is not feeling like you have tools, not feeling like maybe is this the right thing? Is this not the right thing? And my heart really went out to those parents and wanting to, how do I support them? How do we support them? Because these kiddos are our next generation. They are the ones who are going to hold the world in their hands, right? So I don't know. My heart just goes out to them.
Yeah. And when you're talking about this, the thought of what can I do as a parent to help my child? I think all parents have this sort of ownership, right? Whether or not your child is neurodivergent or neurotypical, I feel like this is a big weight that all of us carry. And so speaking of that, then how can you explain to us maybe how you actually do work with parents of neurodivergent children as a therapist? Are you providing mostly therapy for the parents, or is it more finding them the resources they need to support their kids better?
So in my private practice, I am a support for the parent. And in my practice, my goal is to create a place that emulates just safety. It is a place of calm, and it's a place of quietness, and it's a place to be completely vulnerable. Being a parent with neurotypical or even neurodivergent children, there is so much outside noise. And I want to create a place where parents can come, where individuals can come and say and share with me maybe some of their deepest, darkest internal thoughts, those thoughts that you're not supposed to say out loud. Because as parents, we often put ourselves in the back burner. We often forget we need to show up for ourselves. We need some quiet. We need some calm. We need a support system where someone to really share our thoughts and maybe even sometimes kind of work out some of the kinks of our thoughts and what do I want to do with it. A parent with a neurodivergent child, they are not privileged with even maybe sometimes time, or even that quiet in their house, because their demand of their child is even more. And the parents that I do work with now, they will say, like, when they're able to speak their piece and when they're able to share with me some of their thoughts, right? Like, they will often say, thank you for listening to me. Because as much as parenting, we sacrifice ourselves, but those parents with neurodivergent kiddos, they don't have that. And they are showing up for their kiddos even 100 times more. So in my practice, it is very much creating that space. And then it's also, okay, well, how can we prioritize your self-care? How can we also prioritize you? And then let's talk about some of the tools. Let's also talk about how do we empower you and your child to really embrace their disorder, whatever their diagnosis is. Because the world is such a noisy place with all their expectations. So then it's like coming back and saying, well, what do you want? And how can we change some of that narrative? Because it can feel really lonely. And even, a common question of parents will have is, I can't just leave my kiddo. I can't find childcare. Or the school is calling me because they're having behaviors, right? And again, this is where the parents of neurodivergent children, like, they show up in a different way, and it does take a lot more time and energy. So in my practice, it really is, let's show up for yourself.
Yeah. And I think there's also a lot of misunderstanding in terms of how to support the children. So when you mentioned, like, the school is calling or it's hard to find childcare, you can't just hop on Urban Sitter and be like, I need to find a babysitter. There are such unique needs to how to support a child who is neurodivergent that people who are skilled and trained to support neurotypical children might not know about. They may not be things they've learned in their early childhood education, if they even have those qualifications. There are more sensitivities, more accommodations of how to be sensitive to the needs of children who are neurodivergent that an average childcare provider might not think about. And that is often taken for granted. And so I think about those parents who have such a unique experience with their children. And it is such a spectrum, right? That there's, like, some folks that might be experiencing severe autism versus folks that do not have very severe autism. And that looks very different across the board. I do feel like the recent approaches and philosophy when it comes to neurodivergence is truly, again, this embracing that it is a brain that functions differently, and that there's not something wrong with your child, that your child doesn't need to be corrected or fixed or changed. I think maybe a decade ago, treatment or support for ASD leaned more towards, like, let's make your kiddo look more neurotypical. Mm-hmm. Let's fit them into this neurotypical box. What do you think is changing in the mental health community to support and instill hope when it comes to neurodivergence?
Well, I will say that we're not, right, as a community, as a mental health community, and even as a neurodivergent community, there's been a shift. And because we have also expanded the understanding and matured in our understanding of what does neurodivergence look like, there's a lot more work to be done. And sometimes a lot of therapists will say, I think this is, we need to go back to autism treatment, and right. But what we're also seeing, because the language of our feelings and teaching our kiddos our feelings and using that language, therapists sometimes will say, I don't quite know what to do with that. But then there's movement in recognizing that, especially our higher functioning autistic individuals and kiddos, they can receive autism treatment and therapy at the same time. They will each in their own way work on, how do I socialize with somebody? And when I'm internalizing some shame, or I'm recognizing, my interactions with peers, they're not typical. And then it does lead into self-blame, or we're seeing in some kiddos, teenagers, that they're feeling anxious or they're feeling depressed. And it's a lot of conversation right now of how do we, as a mental health provider and as with the autism treatment, how do we come together and support these kiddos? How do we teach them? This is my feeling, and I'm very entitled to this feeling, and what can we do to cope with it? But sometimes parents will ask me, what do I tell my kiddo who is on the spectrum? What do I tell them? And I truly, in my heart of heart, right, kiddos with ADHD, I say they have a superpower, because especially our ADHD kiddos, they can multitask, and that is where their brain thrives. I wish I had the superpower to be able to multitask. Or for some of our autistic kiddos, they're hyper focused. And in neurotypical kiddos, we call that resilience. We call that tenacity. So why can't we use some of those adjectives and language to describe also our neurodivergent population?
I love hearing that frame like that, because it's almost like I hear this a lot because, I have a daughter, and even as myself, when I was a child, we're often called bossy, right? We have this new thing now where we're like, but bossy means when you're older that you're just a really good leader, right? And what's wrong with that characteristic or trait to have? So that reframe of thinking, this is my superpower. I kind of like that to explain to a child. How do you harness your strengths and move forward with that? So when you say treatment of autism versus therapy, are you talking about kind of the same thing? We may be jumping ahead here, but I'm trying to process and wrap my brain around this.
So in therapy, in more mental health therapy, they're going to talk about feelings. They're going to talk about, what does it feel like in my body when I'm feeling depressed or feeling anxious? And then talking about, well, what can we do to maybe listen to our body, and what is our body needing, and what are these things I'm going to try? With autism treatment, that can look like social skills group. That can really look like looking at their behaviors and what is their function of behaviors. And the most common autism treatment is called ABA, Applied Behavior Analysis, and that's looking at the function of behavior and how do we support that kiddo. So I'll give an example. So oftentimes kiddos with autism, they have challenges with transitions, or they have challenges with when things do not go as expectedly, because it's almost like they can perceive the world in a very black and white mentality and perspective. So when things fall into the gray, is what I like to call it, they don't know what to do with that. They don't know how to handle that, because they really thrive. Kiddos with autism really thrive on structure and routine. And autism treatment shows them and teaches them, okay, well, the world doesn't always function like that. So what do we need to do to help you understand and to succeed in our society of when things don't quite go as planned or as we would like? What do we do? How do we then pivot? And how do we like reevaluate what are the current choices and make a decision from there? In the neurotypical, for neurotypical kiddos, and they may have these challenges, maybe we would use the label as spoiled sometimes. And in the same breath, like it's this negative connotation. Mm-hmm. And that's also like when we look at a kiddo with autism on the outside, just like mental health, you don't always see it. It's not like, a label that is right across your forehead. So when parents are you're in the grocery store and you're seeing a kiddo who's having a really hard time because they ran out of their very specific flavored, ice cream, right? The immediate thought for people is they're being a brat. They're being spoiled. A lot of that negative language. So it is very much with autism treatment or ABA, it's teaching them, kiddos with autism, okay, now what? Now what do we do? And teaching them a lot of how do we manage those big feelings.
Thanks for explaining that, because for somebody who has not worked with this specific field too, I think this is helpful to explain it I think Peggy has mentioned to me ABA before, and I personally don't have as much of an understanding. So I think this may help some of our listeners who might be in my boat. I'm going to shift us a little bit because we are a podcast that talks about the Asian American Pacific Islander experience with mental health. And so I'm curious if you have noticed in your practice right now, are there any differences amongst how AAPI families might process the diagnosis or the reality of ASD or neurodivergence versus non-Asian American families?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the best way, one way of thinking about it is AAPI community, how, especially like my parents' generation of like immigrants, how they perceive someone's success and wealth is by almost like these trophies that they take home, right? And these trophies can look like, what are their jobs? What does their career look like? What does their family life look like, right? Are they in a relationship? Do they own a house, right? It's a lot of these physical achievements. And some of my families within the AAPI community, and they find out their kiddo have this diagnosis, they really struggle with that. And part of it is it's because what it's triggering is, and difficult to accept is, oh my gosh, how is this now neurodivergent personality, how is it going to reflect on us as a family unit? And how is it going to get in the way of my kiddo ascertaining these trophies and these achievements? And then there's denial, there's shame. I have some families who they learn of their kiddo's diagnosis and they say, no, that's not us. That's not my kiddo. They're just a little quirky. No, they don't need services. Or my family members are telling me they're just young, they'll outgrow it. Or, I don't want to say this out loud. I don't want to tell the school that my kiddo has this because then they're going to be labeled. Or nobody in my family has that. Peggy, you mentioned maybe it was not diagnosed, but then you look back and reflect oh, you're very similar to whoever it is. And then that individual will say, no, that's not me. So it's a lot of conversations. It's a lot of holding that space. And then the parent also being ashamed themselves because later on, a year, 2 years passes and they say, their behaviors were having the same challenges.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I should have listened. I shouldn't have listened to the noises, the voices in the family. I should have trusted my gut. I kind of knew something was going on. And that I will say there's hope because the stigma is still very much there. But there is a lot more conversation of, look, neurodivergent does not mean the end all be all. It's merely, and that's why I like to say it's their superpower. Let's look at it from their perspective and really rewrite the script. Let's use it as their strength. Because when we're able to get on board with that and accept that, then that also allows us to make space for those feelings, to putting those feelings of loneliness and guilt and shame aside. And it's, again, there's so much unknown that can be really scary, and also a reflection on us as a parent. Do I know what I'm doing? Do I know how to help my kiddo? Because that, as a mom, that is one of the hardest things, to see your kiddo uncomfortable, in pain, and not being able to help or to support it or even to make it go away sometimes.
Yeah. When you're saying a lot of this stuff, I'm reflecting back on some of these themes, and there is a lot of parallel to mental health stigma, because if you come out and say, I have depression, I have anxiety, I have bipolar disorder.
Mm-hmm.
We had a guest that talked about how her dad just flat out would not tell the school or send her for help for her bipolar disorder because they thought that was the end of it. Was like slapping a label on it was the end of her chances of getting into a good college, getting married, having kids. And that sort of denial, I think the longer that you deny that, like you said, it may just prolong getting the help that you actually need when you could have gotten that a little bit sooner. And not to say or blame people that maybe can't accept it right now, but maybe that's where your job comes into play, is that helping parents process this and being able to move forward with their own internal struggles so that they can be available to help their kids. Same with like, if the mom is not well, if the mom has depression or anxiety or these things she's struggling with, she can't be a present mom to her child. And how do we help these parents so that moving forward, now they can be as strong as they can be to advocate for their child and find them the help that they actually need to succeed in life? It's not a death sentence. Right. How do you survive with it?
Right. And that's why in my practice, it's, yes, having my background is really helpful, but first and foremost, I am here to support the parents because their presence, their availability, their vulnerability, their ability, like all of that really ties into a partially of how well their kiddo, neurodivergent kiddo, is able to succeed moving forward.
Yeah, and I imagine nowadays there's even more support and resources and awareness for parents of neurodivergent children. And I think maybe back then it really, the stigma of what it looked like was really hard. And just like Jasmine said, with any other mental health diagnosis, as time goes on and as there's more awareness, people are like, oh, you can completely coexist with your diagnosis and live and thrive and live a life that feels meaningful and productive. And yeah, I think there still sounds like there's a lot of change that needs to happen, whether it's in schools or even with pediatricians or whatever it looks like in the community. What do you think needs to change on a macro level to better support not just the children, but the parents?
Oh my goodness. I could have an entire podcast episode just on this question. And this really goes back to the limited funding of resources collectively. You know, Peggy, you're right. There are definitely a lot of more resources available now, but we definitely need stronger disability policies around this and funding around this, whether it's in the school system, in the community. Certainly there are things, resources-wise, there's resources at school, there's resources in the community, and there's resources that families can get even with the medical system. But one of the things, like even within each one of these entities, they are still lacking. So, and I'll give an example. At school, if you have a neurodivergent kiddo who can't sit still because they have ADHD, or you have a kiddo who's diagnosed with autism in a general education classroom, and they really could benefit from a one-on-one aid, that's not possible. And then they get sent home. And who do they call? They call the parents. So then the parents find themselves, okay, now I'm taking all this time off to go pick up my kiddo from school. And it's almost like this never-ending cycle, because then it's the parents feeling like, well, I'm worried about my job, because not all employers they may not have the flexibility of working from home, for instance. And so, and a big one is childcare. I oftentimes have parents saying, I can't find the appropriate childcare for my kiddo because they have been asked to leave because of their behaviors, and we can't support them in a safe way. So then you'll have parents feeling they will rely on family, or some parents, they have to quit their job because they have to be available for their kiddo. And this is where I feel like there needs to be policies of how do we support these families in a way that's sustainable. Can you guys imagine like just day in, day out, you are the main caretaker for your kiddo and you don't have support. Peggy, I think you mentioned earlier, like it's not like you can just go on care.com and go find somebody. You are needing to find somebody who has this very specific training that even early education trainings with that curriculum, you don't get. I think maybe they talk about being kiddos on the neurodivergent spectrum, but not specifically. How do you work with them? So, like I said, I can go on and on about this. And I think there needs to be, I don't know if it'll be helpful, but maybe a shift from this is their diagnosis to looking at someone's behaviors and looking at their kiddos' behaviors. Because if we start doing that, I think that it will allow more space to actually talk about solutions instead of just focusing on all the things that this kiddo is not doing well.
Yeah, almost like a more strength-based approach. It's like instead of like pathologizing it, it's like, okay, what can my kiddo do? The other thing that I was thinking of too, because I used to work in like the health insurance space, the number of inquiries we would get to get, social skills groups covered or ABA therapy covered. And it was an uphill battle every time. It was either not in network or they had like session limits or they had all these hoops to jump through in terms of you need to get the diagnosis first, you need to get this assessment, now you need that treatment plan renewed. There was just so many hoops to jump through for parents just to get their services covered. And it was just tooth and nail for a lot of these families just trying to get their insurance to pay for it, because it was like, can't just go out and do it. They're like, you need this, and you just need line item by line item of all the things you have to get covered. And it was just such an uphill battle for so many of these parents.
Yeah. And you're doing assessments in all these different areas. Like the school system, with the medical system, they are each doing their own assessment. And then based on that, they get to decide, is your child entitled to services? Do they meet criteria? And sometimes parents are like, this is so backwards. I need this. I'm needing help. Like, why am I feeling alone in this? I don't know quite how to advocate for my kiddo. And it goes back into the theme of what am I doing wrong? The theme of shame and guilt and ownership. And it's a lot of that. So yeah, in my practice, I mean, I do use strength-based. That is something that I gravitate towards, especially working with these parents or any clients of mine, because it's important. I think each one of us has something great about us, and let's highlight that instead of focusing on all the negatives.
Do you also feel like maybe there's not enough people or personnel trained to handle working with children on the spectrum? As in, like, we just don't have enough. It's almost like we don't have enough therapists or mental health professionals. We don't have enough people who are actually trained to work even with like moms in perinatal population, because that's not something that they specifically drill down or focus on in trainings at schools and things like that. Do you feel like that might be also a missing piece of the puzzle? Or are there people out there we just aren't tapping into that resource, or insurance is not covering that?
I feel like the neurodivergence population and even that community can be sometimes so siloed that, and like I said before, right, like mental health and the autism community, like together, there isn't much overlap sometimes. And we're still, as a society, also trying to figure out how are we going to support these families and support these kiddos. And I think that partially that may be a reason too. In with ABA treatment or just treatment for autism kiddos, the turnover rate for those staff is extremely high because they're not paid enough. And this goes back into my soapbox of what do we need to do more of? What does, on the macro level, what does it look like? And this really goes back down to funding.
Yeah. So then I guess with what we do have, what are resources that are available right now for parents of neurodivergent children?
So like I mentioned, the medical system has their own treatment and they have their own criteria. With the school system, they have their own, and oftentimes parents have to ask for an IEP. And then with the federal system, that's where families can apply for the regional center, depending on where you're living and what county, right? That regional center is labeled something different. And then there's also the disabilities right of California. If parents just Google that, sometimes they'll find local nonprofit resources for that. And that is truly being able to connect with the neurodivergent community is probably the best resource, I want to say, because it is creating a community. You can talk to somebody else and they just understand. You don't have to explain it. You don't have to kind of go through all the phases and all the behaviors with them. And knowing that there's someone else who just absolutely gets it can be such a relief. UC Davis Mind Institute is another great one. They have some videos online. I think it's free of charge. I think you could just go on there. UCLA CART is another resource. I believe that UCLA, their specific program focuses on social interactions for some of the teenage youth. And a dad actually that I spoke to yesterday, he gave me a resource and he said there was a book that was recommended to him by an ABA vendor, and it's called The Science of Making Friends, Helping Socially Challenged Teens and Young Adults. And he said that book was really, really helpful for him. So I don't have too many recommendations like books, because that just parents' needs and what they're looking for can vary. But this stood out to me because social interaction is one of the criteria for kiddos with autism, especially our high functioning autistic kiddos. And when I say high functioning autistic kiddos, it may look like these are oftentimes kiddos who are diagnosed at a later age because they do so well at masking. You wouldn't have kind of known, like people always sometimes explain them as, oh, they're just kind of quirky. This is just who they are. This is just what they do. But when they really look at it, they do qualify for autism. So oftentimes these kiddos do really well with conversing with adults because they can adults are a little bit more giving with minors and we allow the minors to talk. But this book, this dad said, was a great resource for him to understand what does it look like.
You mentioned masking. I don't know if all of our listeners understand this is a term you hear a lot in the neurodivergence community. Can you just kind of summarize for folks what is masking and what kind of is the purpose of it?
Yeah, that's a great question. So as social beings, and even at a young age, we can observe our surroundings and we will learn what is socially acceptable, what are things I'm supposed to do, what are things I'm not supposed to do, what is not acceptable. So for example, we see somebody crying, someone who is neurotypical, how that computes in their brain is, oh, they're feeling sad. I should ask them, are you okay? So for someone who is autistic, they see someone is crying. Period. They don't quite compute that person's emotion. They maybe don't even quite understand because it doesn't really pertain to them personally. They'll see somebody crying and maybe think, well, I'm happy right now. That person is fine. So masking is when our kiddos see that, oh, I have observed when someone is crying, someone else goes up and says, are you okay? So masking is, now that I've seen that interaction, I know that I should say, are you okay? So it is learning socially, what are you supposed to do? It's almost like even as adults, you go into a new place, you're looking, I don't know, you're standing in line for a boba place and you're like, I don't know where this boba place is. Oh, everyone formed a line to the right. I'm going to follow the line. I'm not going to just form a line by myself.
Thank you for explaining that. I feel like it's so hard, even as a neurotypical person, sometimes to know what the right social, thing to do is too. So I imagine how much harder that must be for a neurodivergent child or individual. So we'll definitely list the resources that you mentioned in the show links so people can take a look at that. Are there specific support groups, I guess? Like, because what you're describing, like, of communities and stuff, I imagine, like, maybe like a Facebook group of people locally or something, but are there specific like support groups that you know of for like parents of neurodivergent children?
I don't. There isn't something specific. I know that sometimes the regional center may have that information, or even some of the local under the Child Disabilities and Act and their different community, I guess, like kind of satellite offices based on your county. Sometimes they have that. And that's what I would say. That would probably be the best way of searching that and finding that.
Sounds like there's a niche that could be filled.
There's certainly a need. There's certainly a need. And this is where I think the work for us to continue.
Yeah, definitely more work to be done in this area. So our listeners are listening to this and they're thinking, okay, either our listeners are parents of a child who is neurodivergent, or they're a parent of a child who is neurotypical. And maybe there's a group of our listeners who are this middle group where they're not sure if their child falls into this umbrella of neurodivergence. What would you recommend a parent do if they suspect that their child may be on the spectrum?
The number one thing I would tell the parents, especially if they're in this unknown, like trust your gut. And I say that because even as a therapist, and I tell my clients and parents or individuals, our body is designed to feed us information, whether that be thoughts that comes up, feelings, or our body reacts and it shows us. And I say this because I have spoken to enough parents where they tell me, I knew it. And I brought it up, but I was dismissed. But and I just let it go. And I wish we had X, Y, and Z, whatever resources. So like, I wish. So that is my first, I think, most important urge for parents is really trust your gut. No one's going to know your kiddo better than you. So once you trust your gut, you can ask questions. Go back to your pediatrician. Ask questions. And I understand there's such a wide range, and with kiddos being diagnosed even at an earlier age now, I know that pediatricians are certainly trying to allow kiddos the opportunity to learn or pick up some skills or develop right on their own timeline and accord. And we love that. We appreciate that. At the same time, though, if you're truly feeling like something is happening, I don't know what it is, I'm trying all these different things, right? Ask questions, ask for support. And in those instances, I would say, get ready to advocate. Get ready to be that person in your kiddo's corner.
Yeah, I think it can never hurt to get a second opinion or ask around. But I feel like the barrier sometimes may be that denial piece that you were talking about. Is that like, what implications are there if we are to go down this road? And maybe sometimes it's like, I'm not ready for that. Like, if I open this can of worms, what does that mean? And so I think a parent has to also be prepared mentally to handle that. So, but I'm like nodding my head at everything you're saying, because yes, trusting your gut is huge. As a mom, you're attuned to your kids, and so you're the one that has to sort of speak up because they can't. So, but that's so hard. I feel like it's really hard. So yeah, that's why they need the support. And I guess as somebody on the other side, like if we were friends of a parent who might have a neurodivergent child and we want to be able to support them, what are things that friends can do to be helpful and supportive?
I think I've said this already, like the parenting journey is really hard, and sometimes it can feel quite lonely in that journey, because we very much get very busy with the mundane task of day in, day out, going to work, taking care of your kiddos, etc. For parents with kiddos, neurodivergent kiddos, their demand is a lot higher. And so the risk of them feeling even more isolated and lacking support is even higher. The most helpful thing as a friend is to check in on your friends, is to check in with the parents. The expectation is not that you're going to be an expert. You're going to be able to, help them take care of their kid, and you're going to go over there and do all the interventions, right? That's not the expectation. It is more so calling and reaching out. And maybe it's a text message, hey, I'm thinking of you today. And it is knowing that you have a community behind you is the most powerful thing. I know your podcast is about parents, moms, dads, postpartum. And even in that journey, personally as well, the thing that kind of got me through was my community. And postpartum depression, postpartum anxiety, that is almost acute. Parents with neurodivergent kiddos, it's not acute. It is lifelong for them. So knowing that they have people to turn to in times of need, whether it's the day-to-day, whether it's an emergency, that is really impactful. And when I say show up, maybe some people are thinking, well, what am I going to text them? What am I going to say to them? Right? And it's not, the conversation does not need to be intense. It doesn't need to be, hey, how's your kiddo's treatment going? Hey, right? Sometimes they just need to laugh and they just need to be themselves. I said earlier that within my own practice, I focus on them because they need that space. They need a reminder almost of what is their identity beyond being a mom or being a dad? Who are they? What brings them joy? And I think that's so easy to forget as a parent.
Yeah, I think it's humanizing who you are. You're not, just because this is now a role you stepped into, that you're not the other parts of you too. And recognizing that and helping your friends remember that they also exist outside of this hat that they wear now, this lifelong hat that they might have to carry, but to remind them that you're there for them no matter what. So yeah, that's beautiful. Okay.
I will end on the families that I have worked with. What I have noticed, those families who feel like they have a good handle on working with their kiddos, is really those family or those individuals or those parents who have a great support system. And it is not just in the now, but it is creating a system for them in the future. For when, as parents, our goal is to pass before our kiddos, right? But also thinking about that.
Yeah. In the spirit of healing, what would Clarissa today go back and tell Clarissa in the past during some of her hardest times?
Clarissa today would tell Clarissa in the past to find opportunities to create joy.
I like that. Thank you so much. Clarissa, thank you so much for your time today and sharing your experience with us. I hope that this will be helpful to somebody out there who either has that neurodivergent child or somebody who wants to learn more about it to be able to support friends that they know with neurodivergent children, or somebody who's in the gray, because we live in the gray. So yeah, thanks again for your time.
Thank you for having me.
We wanted to acknowledge that we recognize this episode is from a therapist's perspective of her work supporting the parents of neurodivergent children, and that we also know how valuable and important it is to hear from neurodivergent voices themselves, whether it be neurodivergent parents or parents of neurodivergent children. To continue this conversation and learn more about how to support the neurodivergent community, we have another episode coming up with AAPI moms who are neurodivergent, who work with neurodivergent children, and who are raising neurodiverse families. Please look out for this future episode soon, and thank you for your support. If you'd like more information about Clarissa, we will include how to reach her in our show notes. You can find our therapist profile on Psychology Today. Of note, the resources mentioned in today's episode are specific to families living in California where Clarissa is licensed. We will include more resources in our show notes for listeners who do not live in California.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Healing the Tigress. The more we share these stories, the more we can help other AAPI mothers and partners. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to keep supporting this mission, please hit the subscribe button to the show and take a few seconds to leave a rating. An extra big thanks if you would also leave a review to boost our show visibility and help other AAPI folks find us.
You can also follow us on Instagram at Healing the Tigress, or even better, check out our Patreon at patreon.com/Healing the Tigress podcast to support us more. Inside the Patreon, we will be offering more bonus episodes, sneak peeks, and a community for you to help shape our podcast too. Thanks for being here.
Healing the Tigress is produced and edited by Peggy and Jasmine.
Music for this show is remixed by Dr. Tony Huynh of Tony Mixes.
Our intro music is a cover of You and Me by Z Avi, played by our co-host Peggy.
Our outro music is a cover of Green Island Serenade, played by Jasmine's sister.
Cover art design is by Dr. Angela Chung.